Happy to be here. I think we'd probably be remiss if we did not acknowledge the horror of what happened earlier today in Brooklyn with the mass shooting. And we send out our best thoughts and prayers to the victims, and the hope that the New York City Police can solve this, horrible situation as quickly and as painlessly as possible, given the kind of pain that's already been visited. So we'll be discussing today a book that speaks of both the joys and sometimes the horrors of New York City history. I guess today goes down in one of the latter categories more than the former. It's important to note that this guide, the People's Guide to New York City, is in a long tradition of alternative guides to the history and nature of the United States, and particularly its cities, starting with the WPA Writers Project guides to various cities, including the ones that the Federal Writers Project put together for places like New York. I'm old enough to remember when I first came to New York in the 1970s and worked with the Radical Historians Organization, MARHO. We were very involved in walking tours and creating walking tours. So I think of this book as representing kind of a pinnacle of what we were all trying to do 45 years ago, to celebrate the alternative histories of this city and many cities around the country. Let me briefly sort of sketch the program. I'll introduce the three panelists a little bit more formally. Each of them will speak in turn about the genesis of the project. They will describe the book and the framing of the book, and then we'll get a chance to look at and explore several of the sites that are featured in the book. The four of us will have a conversation following that, and at around 7:15, our hope is that the questions will come through the question and answer portal, and I'll pose the questions that are indicated there to the panelists, and we'll have a conversation that will extend until about 7:30. So without further ado, let me introduce first Carolina Bank Munoz, who's professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of CUNY. My colleague at SLU, Penny Lewis, who is professor of labor studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. And last but certainly not least, Emily Thompson-Molina, who is associate professor of sociology and director of the Center for the Study of Brooklyn at Brooklyn College. All three or four of us proud CUNY faculty and supporters of this important institution. So Carolina, it will speak first about the genesis of the project. Penny will follow by describing the book and some of the framing of the book, and Emily will be third to explore some of the sites. So without further ado, Carolina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here on such a difficult day. It's good to have you. We're thrilled to be here. And thanks to SLU for organizing the event. So 10 years ago, I went to hear Laura Pulido talk about A People's Guide to LA at Broman's Bookstore in Pasadena, California. And I was absolutely enthralled by the concept of a guidebook as an intellectual project, as well as an alternative to existing guidebooks that focus on glitz, glamour, consumption, and spectacle, often at the expense of the lived experiences of people of color, immigrants, working class people, indigenous people, and LGBTQ communities. In Laura's presentation, I learned new things about LA, about my history and my community. Growing up in LA, I was always uncomfortable with the LA that was being crafted by people who came to visit me. You must be so lucky to live in a city full of famous people. That's at the center of the film industry. That's rich and beautiful, I would hear, while internally always thinking, that's not my LA. That's not what I see. My LA is immigrant, working class, struggles to get by. My LA is the Justice for Janitors movement and the big May Day marches. So Laura's presentation really spoke to me because she was describing my experience and the experience of so many like me. At the time of the presentation of that LA guide, I had already been in New York City for 8 years. And similar to my experience in LA, I was growing tired of family and friends visiting and saying, wow, you're so lucky to live in such a majestic city with so much culture and museums and theater and attractions. And yet my New York City was failing infrastructure at CUNY, gentrification, the fight against the Barclays Center, Occupy Wall Street, and our union contract fight. I kept thinking that so many of my students didn't have access to the things that attract people to New York City. And I felt like people didn't understand the, quote unquote, real New York. That nagging feeling led me to ask Wendy Chang, one of the editors of the People's Guide to LA, if there was a plan for a People's Guide to New York City. No was the answer, and little did I know that the next 10 years of my life would be consumed with the project. So upon returning to New York City from that LA trip, I started thinking about who would embark on this ludicrous idea of writing a People's Guide to New York City. And I started writing to friends and colleagues to hear what sites they would include in such a book. Penny shared such enthusiasm for the project that I immediately asked her to join me in writing it. But both of us are labor activists and scholars, and we knew that we needed someone who had like an urban studies and geography lens. And Emily had recently joined the Department of Sociology at Brooklyn College, and I knew about her focus on cities and housing, and so it was a natural fit. Luckily for us, she agreed. So why a People's Guide? From the People's Guide description, quote, a different kind of guidebook. One that explains power relations in a way everyone can understand, and which shares stories of struggles and resistance that inspire and educate activists, students, and critical thinkers. As the series editors argue, the books in the series are about creating, quote unquote, deliberate political disruption by making visible the invisible social dynamics that undergird the city. We hope to shift how you determine what and who are important in New York City. It's not just about what to do and what to see, but rather about what to know and how to peel through the layers of history. Reconceptualizing a guidebook in this way not only democratizes knowledge, but it allows ordinary citizens to make claims on our right to the city. Learning from history and contemporary struggles facilitates bolder demands for the kind of city we want to live in. A city with affordable housing, free public higher education, better transportation, more parks, a cleaner environment, and better wages and working conditions, among many other things. Before turning it over to Penny, I just want to say that this project has been a labor of love for the three of us, but it wouldn't have been possible without our advisory board, the participation of students and community members and organizations, scholars who wrote the entries, Scott Dexter, one of our main photographers, and the many New York City institutions who gave us access to photos and archival materials. It really took a village.
Carolina, thanks. Steve, thank you for moderating SLU. Thanks for hosting this. And it's great to be here. And I'll just say, personally, my relationship to this book also feels highly overdetermined, in part to go to Steve's opening. I was given the WPA guide on 2 different occasions as a young person, given the way that I'm a native New Yorker, and the way that I always talked about New York. 2 close people gave me copies of the WPA guide thinking, this is the perfect book for you. And here we are 30 years later, writing our own version. So Carolina talked about the deliberate political disruption that the series that we're a part of are hoping to make. And I'm going to focus on what that looks like in New York, like how we try to go about this in New York City. So the operating premise of the book is that the, quote, life and landscape of New York are products of social power and its attendant struggles. And I think there are a few particular political interventions that we make across the book. First, we pay attention to the actual struggles that have made the city along vectors of class, race, gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, immigration status, access to healthcare, education, housing, transportation, information, culture. It's a very long list, and it's a list that underscores aspects that we don't normally see in guidebooks, like the social reproduction of the city itself. And we try to keep our eyes trained on that. We pick sites that tell stories of struggles that start in the colonial era and go up to Black Lives Matter and labor organizing at Amazon, which has become all the more brilliant this past couple of weeks. We emphasize certain tensions that we see shaping the city across time and space. And these tensions aren't necessarily unique to New York City, but we'd argue they're more pronounced and determinative here than they are in many other places. So one, for example, is between private wealth and public goods. New York City has an incredible concentration of wealth, the highest number of billionaires, for instance, and the power that private wealth operates is really to be seen everywhere in this city. But arguably, New York also has the most developed, if underfunded, public infrastructure in the country, and as well as the most union dense. And we have all kinds of public entitlements, like a right to shelter. I mean, so the public sector in this city has survived a thrashing, but is still pretty extraordinary, including the institution that we all teach at. So that's one of these tensions. But a couple of others that we look at is between what we see as the city's extreme cosmopolitanism and tolerance and sense of anything goes, but the kind of sophistication that is matched by a kind of provincial clannishness that is also typical of New York City, and helps shape its culture and its interactions and actions. We also look at tensions between the fairly pronounced freedom of expression that characterizes so much of New York City culture, and we look at this both in terms of just cultural freedom, but also the public space and and how people occupy the space of the city, but how that is constrained and challenged by the intensive policing and state security apparatus, especially since 9/11, but it's actually been true throughout the city's history. The book is historical, but it's also up to the present. But historically speaking, for example, we have an entry on the Park Avenue Armory, and that the armories that dot the city that held National Guard units that put down protests and labor unrest for decades of the city's history. So those are some of the kind of frameworks, but I think one of the things we really hope people get out of this book is that it decenters, we hope that it decenters the way that we normally encounter the city. It's important to us that the book is the whole city. Manhattan has the most sites of any borough, but it gets about a third of the pages of the book altogether. So 2/3 of the book are devoted to outside of Manhattan. Most of our sites, therefore, are out of Manhattan, as are the majority of the thematic tours that we end with. And we break it up by borough. We start in the north, in the Bronx, with Montefiore Hospital and the organizing of 1199 as our first entry. We go through Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, and 134 sites later, some of which were written by others, most of which were written by us. We get to the Staten Island Lenape Burial Ridge, which is in Conference House Park, which is actually the southernmost site in New York State as a whole. So considering the social geography, we also emphasize the natural and built environments that connect and distinguish the city as a whole. So the book has brief essays that intersperse these boroughs. about the city's water supply and the relationship of the city to the upstate watershed communities, the city's many islands, the public transportation, bridges, tunnels, and expressways that first were built to link the city together, but then helped to move people out of it, over the course of the 20th century. And of course, help create the infrastructure of the greater New York area, that we pay less attention to, but that obviously informs the dynamics inside of the urban center of the city as well. So finally, we hope that that people literally see the city differently as they walk around and ask different questions about it. And to that end, there are 3 basic types of sites I think we have inside of this book. First, we have like notable and well-known places that we tell alternative stories about. Like, for example, we open with a story of the Empire State that we tell from a different angle, but we also look at parks like Central Park and Tompkins Square. We look at the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, Yankee Stadium, and each of these have alternative stories associated with them. We also include sites that no longer exist, vanished sites that demonstrate the movements of a people's New York throughout history. And some of them are very well known and some are less so, like the National Organic Fertilizer Plant in Hunts Point, where the community managed to get rid of it. The Brooklyn Labor Lyceum in Brownsville. And finally, we have contemporary sites that are not so well known that underscore the historic and ongoing dynamism of New Yorkers, East New York farms, housing developments, and things like that. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily because she's going to talk more specifically about some of our sites.
Hey, everyone. Thank you to Steve. Thanks to SLU for sponsoring us tonight. And it's good to sort of see all of you. I'm gonna pick up where Penny left off and just kind of quickly introduce you to like a smattering of sites really quickly that give you kind of a flavor of what is in the book that kind of illustrate the themes that Penny was just talking about. And hopefully you will all be able to see this map of our sites. So this is a map of all of the sites in the book. And like Penny said, a third of them are in Manhattan, but most of them are in the outer boroughs. So we really, really want people to see the city differently. And we kind of want to do this in at least 3 ways. The first way is that we want to decenter how people view the city and focus at least equally, if not more, on the outer boroughs. So this map kind of gives you a good idea of that. The second way we really want to encourage people to see the city differently is by really thinking about what makes a place, quote unquote, notable, right? So why is the Statue of Liberty notable? Sorry, that's my cat, if you can hear that. What makes the Statue of Liberty notable? What makes the Empire State Building notable? We tell a few of those stories from, like Penny said, from a different kind of angle, but we really wanted to think about sites that are notable to a people's New York City, right? So the first one I just want to point out is Hunts Point in the Bronx, which is the city's largest food hub. At least 12% of all the food consumed in the city across the boroughs crosses through this part of the city. And at least like a quarter of the produce moves through this corner of the Bronx. So this is a place that we think is really notable, right? We also think that this is a really notable place, which is the site in Brownsville, Brooklyn, of the nation's first birth control clinic. It was founded in 1916 by Margaret Sanger, who has sort of a storied history, but it operated illegally. And of course, it was shut down and she was jailed. But birth control in the United States was not fully legal until 1972. So this was 1916 that this was founded in Brownsville. Another site that we think is really notable to the people's city is, of course, the Amazon warehouse on Staten Island. And we actually put this in the book to highlight the struggles over kind of worker health and safety during COVID. But then, of course, the recent events just happened. And this is, of course, the site of the first successful unionization of Amazon workers in the United States. Another site that we think is really notable is the former site of the Storefront Museum. This is in Jamaica, Queens. This was started by the artist Tom Lloyd, who was part of a group of artists in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, that were really interested in making museums more democratic. So this particular museum was founded to have sort of an Afrocentric philosophy. It's no longer there because it's now part of York College. The building was taken over by York College, but the collection that was there is still at the Queens Library. So we really wanted to shift what we mean by notable places, right, in this book. We also really wanted to highlight sites that kind of illuminate the stories of how social struggle really produces the everyday landscape that all of us see every day. So I want to talk about two sites in that regard. The first one is this, which is a building on Prospect Avenue in the Bronx that was slated for demolition in 1965. And it was not demolished because Dr. Evelina Lopez Antonetti and her daughter took it over for this grassroots organization called United Bronx Parents, which really fought for educational justice in the Bronx. And they had a bunch of wins, mostly in bilingual education and kind of supporting mothers and the educational attainment of mothers. They moved on, the organization moved on, but this building is still there. It was not demolished because they occupied it. Another one of these sites, which unfortunately has vanished, is 5 Points, also called the Institute for Higher Burning. It was known as the Fun Factory. This is in Long Island City in Queens. It was one of the world's premier graffiti meccas, and it featured almost 200 artists. And the owner of the space had was basically convinced to kind of donate the space to artists because it's so visible by the 7 train. And so tons of artists were showcasing their work here, and tons of people were coming to New York just to see the work that was on display here. But in 2013, the owner's family decided to develop the space for luxury apartments. But before they demolished this warehouse, they painted it over all white overnight, and they named the residential project 5 Points Towers. And then they raised the building. The artists sued and they won $6 million in damage. So it's a vanished site, but it's a bit of a win for the people's New York City in that regard. So hopefully these sites really give you a little bit of a sense of the kinds of things that we include in the book and the kinds of themes that we're developing. And also, it sort of illustrates these tensions between public and private, creative expression and repression, all of these things that Penny was talking about, and hopefully gives you a good idea of the types of sites, right? Like important sites that we tell, or sites that are in other guidebooks that we tell alternative stories of, vanished sites, but then also just ordinary places with really extraordinary histories. So I'll hand it over to Steve because we really want to talk more in a conversation about all this stuff that we just threw at you.
This is fascinating. Thank you to the three of you for your presentation, but most importantly for the book, which strikes me as really an incredibly important contribution. I'd be remiss if I didn't note that the United Bronx Parents, one of the leaders of that organization was a woman named Ellen Lurie, who is the mother of Rebecca Lurie, who is Penny's and my colleague at SLU, just to sort of close the circle there. A very important organization, and Evelina Antonetti is a very important a historical figure in the history of this city, and definitely, as is Ellen Lurie. So I'm glad that you featured that. I guess maybe the place to start is Penny mentioned the phrase, but I think it might have gone a little quickly past. You see the work as a deliberate political disruption. And I'd like you to kind of, each of you maybe say a little bit more about what you think that means and how it applies directly to what you've produced here.
That's a great question, Steve. So for me, I think it's, time and time again, seeing guidebooks focus on Manhattan, and even kind of radical guidebooks. The tendency has been to center Manhattan as the place for New York City's kind of culture and activism. And so for me, it was really important. And in fact, when I was talking to Wendy Chang about this, the folks that she had reached out to about writing a People's Guide to New York City all wanted to focus on either Manhattan or specific boroughs, a guide to Brooklyn or a guide to Manhattan. And so part of that political disruption is really focusing on the city as a whole, all 5 boroughs and all 5 boroughs' contributions to making the city what it is.
Yeah, I was immediately impressed that the place this starts is the Bronx, and that you decentered Manhattan in a fundamental way, and that you use as Penny described it, the social geography of the city in an interesting way. And I think that's an extraordinarily important contribution. Now, the question is, can you get people to go to the Bronx? But that's hopefully what the book will do. It'll prime people in a sufficient way. Penny and Emily, you want to add anything to what Carolina just said?
Yeah. I mean, I think hopefully we'll get people to definitely go all over the city. And we actually did think about trying to have sites that are kind of in clumps, so that, so if you look at the map, we have like little places where people go to rather than everywhere, so that we could encourage people to actually get on the train and go. But I mentioned this in what I said, but I would elaborate. The fact that we pay attention to social reproduction, that we have housing developments. I mean, a lot of our book talks about housing, like where people actually live in New York, right? We cover high schools and colleges. We look at work, we look at like how people work in this city and like what it means to work in this city. And so that, I think there's a tension for all of us in that a tour guide is like for tourists, right? But we were very much writing this, I think, with New York City residents in mind, and feeling like the guide is as much, if not more, for ourselves, right? I mean, as Carolina was saying, like she didn't see herself in the guides of LA, and we want New Yorkers to see ourselves in this book. And to do that, we highlight places, and we don't want to be voyeuristic. Like that's, we had a lot of deep discussions about like what to include, what not to include, where to send people, where not to send people, because you don't want like people showing up at people's private residences, but we do want to tell the story of like real people's lives. And to me, that's a disruption in the genre of the tour book. And hopefully, to go to Emily's points of like what we see as notable about a city,
Got it. Emily, you want to add anything to that?
I think just the way that I think about the political disruption is just redefining what makes New York like significant, right? And I'll give 2 examples. New York, had the first birth control clinic. New York has the most public housing of any place in the country, right? And Queensbridge is the biggest public housing development in North America, and it's still standing. It hasn't been torn down. Those are the kinds of stories that I think inspire different views and different appreciation of New York, and also just give us guides for how to keep those entitlements and rights kind of going.
So this question of who's the book for, and Penny addressed this somewhat, it's for people from the outside, but it's also very much for people who live in New York City. And that's an interesting sort of balance to strike. I guess it poses the question to me, how do you hope people who buy this guide will use it? You hope that they'll read it cover to cover, which it is entirely possible to do. Will they dip into it as if it were an encyclopedia where they just look up things that they're interested in looking up? Or will they use it to actually decide where to go, how to sightsee in the city? Or is it some, as I assume it will be, some combination of all 3 and maybe other approaches?
Yeah, I hope that people use it in all 3 of those ways. I also really hope that teachers use it in the classrooms in middle and high schools, right? That this is a great opportunity for students to think about their neighborhoods and what's important in their neighborhoods and what we missed. I hope that people own it and contribute to it. And there's going to be there is a website for the series, and we hope to keep the book alive in that website and hope that we can add people's contributions to that. Already I've heard from some people, why didn't you include X, Y, or Z? Because there's no way that we could produce a guidebook that covers everything, right? So I think all three of us really see it as a living document, and we hope to add, to enrich, and to get students themselves and New Yorkers themselves to add entries and think about their city and their neighborhoods.
Anybody else want to add to what Carolina said? So it occurred to me you guys are easy to do this with. You're anticipating all my questions. So my next question was, do you have plans, or does the press have plans to do any kind of digital format for this? Because of course, while this is a wonderful thing, most people won't want to schlep this around in quite the same way as if they had it on a smartphone. And the one thing I would say about the University of California Press is it's been in the vanguard of university presses and interested in digital technologies. So can you say a little bit more about what digital formats this will be available in, as at least if not now, then in the future? And I think I want to also ask you to think a little bit more about what could be the structure of input that people would have to the book, and having an active website and a blog or something that in effect gives people a chance to give you feedback and argue with you. I mean, that would be the best thing, it seems to me, to get to generate arguments about what you've produced and how people feel about either how their neighborhood is presented, or, as the classic case, because we're New Yorkers and we have strong opinions, what the hell were you thinking when you said X, Y, or Z about any one of the sites that you manage in the book? So run with that for a little bit. And if you have more to say about that, that would be great.
Originally, that's such a great question. Thanks. I think to answer your question, there are no immediate plans for any kind of like digital situation based on this book, other than a Kindle edition of the book, which is great. We really wanted the outside of the project to develop an app, actually, for like a smartphone app where you could just be walking around and like audio comes on to tell you the story once you get to certain locations. And I feel like that, I mean, I don't know how that will happen in the future. Maybe someone will do it. We would love that, for someone to develop that, but that is the kind of place where I think like it would be a nice repository of like public comments, right? Where people could submit audio or images or just written comments, and you could, as you're engaging with the app, see all of those comments and hear all of that audio. The question that that the series editors and that we are really contending with is like, how much editing of that? Like, who edits that? Does anybody edit that? Because you can kind of get anyone saying anything, right? And making all kinds of claims without having, another level of editing happening. So I don't know if you guys want to chime in on that.
Well, I mean, I would just say, yeah, we would be so eager to have a more developed web presence. And something Carolina said about like using this in classrooms and inviting students to add to it. I mean, this book, a lot of it is similar to projects that I had in my class. And in fact, a number of students in our New York City Work, Culture, and Politics contributed, research and writing to the book. And I know already, I ran into a friend who teaches at Eastside Community High School who told me that one of his fellow teachers told him she had gotten this book. She had no idea that he knew me. She'd gotten this book, she loved it, and she was assigning it to her students and asking them to, supplement it and also analyze the sites based on their experience, right? So it would be fantastic for us to have that, but it's a resource question. And, it's a resource of time and also, support from the press and other things. And I mean, I think we should give serious thought to it because it would be a project we would have to take on. But I think between the three of us, we have, I think, institutional capacities that we could be tapping into to support something like that.
Yeah, we can have this conversation offline, but I have some ideas about how you might proceed with this, thinking particularly about my colleagues at the Graduate Center and the digital humanities field, and the various digital initiatives at the Graduate Center. Annie Volk, who's starting a public history program as part of the history PhD program. There would be a lot of interest, it seems to me. The new media lab, the interactive technology and pedagogy certificate program. I think there are resources that could be used to expand this and solve some of the problems that Emily raised, which is like, how do you curate a public site? And that's not an easy issue, but there's a lot of experience now in doing that. You don't simply throw the doors open and take anything that comes in over the transom, but there are ways to do this. And I think it would deepen and enrich the book in a fundamental way. We're starting to get some questions in the Q&A, but I have one sort of overarching final question before we turn to the audience, which is, this is clearly a marvelous piece of collective public scholarship. In my field, this is what we call public history. In your field, as Penny has enlightened me, but I know this from Michael Buravoy, it's this public sociology. Do you see any tensions or contradictions with more traditional academic scholarship, or do you think these two approaches can live comfortably? In my career, I just didn't give a damn about it. I didn't care what the academics thought. I wanted to do what I wanted to do. You all, have other things to worry about. I'm safely retired from this now. But.
We're safely in that tradition, I think. That's fair to say.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
I think that, I see it as a work of translation, right? And I think that has just as much merit as, original scholarship. And this is I'm so sorry, my cat is so loud. And when I talk.
Has a contribution to make.
She's having a conversation with me. I think we just don't, I think, well, you guys didn't have to care as much. For me, I know that my department really values this work. They really value public sociology. And so it has not been a concern of mine, a terrible concern of mine. I just think it's important. And I'm lucky to work in a place where everybody equally thinks it's important work.
Great.
And I think that's changing in many departments, which is encouraging.
Carolina, Penny, you want to add anything to that or let it rest?
Yeah, I would just add that this is one of the values of teaching at CUNY, right? Is that the very mission of the institution is to focus on the public, and so that's what we did. It was kind of a no-brainer and super important. I don't think those things have to be in tension. I think that I think 10 years ago when the People's Guide to LA was first written, it was like, wow, how can a guidebook be academic? And I think the authors and editors of that book really pushed us along, not just in geography, but also in sociology, to open that intellectual field up.
Interesting. Penny, you want final word before we turn to questions?
Oh, I agree heartily with what everybody has said. For me, and I'm already looking at some of the questions and this question about like thinking of teachers in mind. We wrote this as teachers as well, right? So we
primarily, right?
Yeah. We were always thinking about what's of use in the classroom, what kinds of conversations can we have with our students about this city and cities in general, and how can this book contribute to that conversation in a way that invites all people reading it and doesn't, push people out. And not that academic writing necessarily pushes people out, but I think we were very much trying to write for a broad audience, and not, and I don't think we're at all, I think it's like a smart book. Like, I think that we keep the conversation high, but we try to engage, the public very seriously. And that's actually like a core part of our goal here.
Can't read the introduction to this book and not realize it's a smart book. Wouldn't have to go any further than that. So the questions we're starting to get. Fred asked,
very academic.
Does your book include some land acknowledgement? As you know, we're occupying the Lenape's land. I know you talked a little bit about that at the outset, Penny. Any of you, do you want to say sort of the sort of ways in which Native people's experience and history are incorporated in the book?
Sure. I mean, I could start, and I will say, unfortunately, I regret that the book does not directly contain a land acknowledgement the way that many of us, when we begin to speak or move or work in any of the spaces in New York, can and I think should acknowledge that we are all in occupied land. But we made a very big effort to do as much as we could to acknowledge the Lenape. We have the site that I mentioned, which kind of tells a bit of the story of the not just the Lenape tribes who were part of Staten Island, but the kind of a lot of the peoples who lived throughout, this kind of, it was called like the Delaware region. So like the Raritans and other groups. And we also acknowledge, and this is a very tough thing about New York, that the genocide and the war that was waged upon the peoples of New York were so effective that the Native communities of New York had largely disappeared very, very, very early on. And so we tell that story as well in introductions to different boroughs, and in the introduction to the book itself.
You addressed the question about, will there be a curriculum guide for public schools? Do you have any plans to do that? Does the press? Or are you hoping that teachers will simply figure out how to use the book the way the teacher that was you mentioned, Penny, or anybody?
So we've been talking about partnering with the UFT on some professional development workshops for using the guide. We don't have like specific plans for a curriculum, but we were hoping that would be a good entry point, since we know a lot of teachers have to, participate in these professional development workshops, that it would be a good way to start. So that's kind of on our list of to-dos. And I've reached out to a bunch of teachers, and I've reached out to some of those teachers have been like UFT reps. And I've also reached out to some like districts. So the next step is to kind of formalize something.
Yeah, and I would say there are probably grant possibilities for this. NEH would be one. It seems to me they have high school, teacher workshops in the summer. You could build an entire workshop around this. People would participate. You might get some of that curriculum development, or study guide kind of work out of that. We did that at the American Social History Project for years, and it helped a lot with our multimedia curriculum. So it seems to me that that's the NEH, but there are other places, it seems to me, where you could go for that. Someone asked, and I assume it's an easy answer, is there an index? And any of you can answer, of course there is, but you want to say, and somebody asked a little bit about more detail about the publishing process. And do you want to say what the relationship was to the press and how the book came out? And I mean, you don't say much, but the book is heavily illustrated. You had a number of photographers. The book is rich in illustration, and obviously that's not an easy thing to do, nor is it easy to get presses to pay for permissions to use photos. So if you can say a little bit more about that publishing process, please do.
Sure. I'll start actually just with the index, which is we had a fantastic indexer, Rob Sauté, who worked really closely with us. And one of our goals in the index was precisely to help organize thematically the book so that if you were interested in any particular theme, like, Black freedom struggles, Black power, if you're interested in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender movements, if you're interested in women's history, if you're interested in, labor struggles, then you could look up that theme, and all the sites are grouped, by a number of themes. So we hope that makes it a much more user-friendly guide. Someone else might want to talk a little bit about the publishing process.
Anybody jump in.
Or not.
Or not.
Steve, can you repeat the question about permissions and the press and publishing? Is that that's how you ended that?
Well, no, it was a more general question about the publishing process. I was particularly interested, having done this for the Who Built America textbook. This is an enormous amount of work. I can only sympathize with whoever ended up having to do it. But people need to understand that a book like this doesn't come together because the words get written. It's a serious process of clearing permissions and layout and design. And this is a beautifully designed book. So,
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Getting the photo permissions, getting the right photos and the photo permissions was as much work as writing the book. It might have been more time consuming. It's a bit of a win for us. We actually got the press to agree to a significantly higher photo permissions budget than they were willing to do. And we really argued really hard for that, because I'm so glad that you're saying this, because this is our goal. We knew that, like, if we didn't have this many photos, it just wouldn't be as good. There were a lot of photos that we couldn't get permissions for, and we're still kind of lamenting those. But fortunately, also, there's so many Creative Commons photos in the book with Creative Commons licenses, and those are becoming more frequent, I'm finding online. So that was a bit of a win for us too. And then the rest of our photos were taken basically by colleagues, which I think turned out really great, actually, in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, it took forever to get all the permissions for all of these photos. Probably at least a year.
COVID. Yeah.
Right, and then the pandemic.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of specific questions that somebody asks: is a book signing planned? Are you going to do the traditional, sit in a bookstore and sign copies of the book? Somebody asked that question.
We've been to Community Books, and they've asked us to come and sign some, and we haven't done that yet. We're going to Blue Stockings, fantastic bookstore, and hopefully we'll be able to sign some there. It's going to be another Zoom presentation, though, because a lot of places are not doing things live. And I should actually say to that same person who asked about the book signing, we do have Cooper Union in the book. So there's an entry on Cooper Union. We talk about the Great Hall and then also the struggles around tuition. So that's just finishing that question. Should we look at some of these other questions?
Yeah, I mean, the other question somebody, Ted asks, is there any discussion of how landfill expanded the city's footprint, and any discussion of Robert Moses's impact on the physical environment? I think that's probably a fairly easy answer.
Regrettably, not so much about infill, except, which is really a regret, actually, except that, go ahead.
I was just saying, we have some. I mean, we talk about it in relation to downtown Manhattan in the Capitalism Wall Street tour, and yeah. That's
true. And we also talk about the transformation of Flushing Meadows Corona Park in preparation for the World's Fair, which Ted Steinberg says was the greatest transformation of this part of the world since the ice caps melted, so that we have tons of Robert Moses, and if I had my way, we would have more Robert Moses, but there's too much Robert Moses in the book. But the big there's two big Robert Moses stories. One directly, the famous story from from Power Broker about East Tremont and the expressways in East Tremont, but then also the loss of San Juan Hill, the neighborhood that was raised to make way for Lincoln Center. But yeah, I was a little bit Robert Moses crazy in these entries, but I think we have some good coverage.
Well, it's hard to think of the physical built environment in New York and not think about Robert Moses.
Absolutely.
For good or ill, mostly for ill in my opinion, but you can't look at the city and not understand that in part it looks the way it does and it functions the way it does because of his outsized influence. So
absolutely,
it's obvious that you would talk about that.
Also, I should just say, we also have one of those thematic essays on bridges, tunnels, and expressways that talks a lot about Moses.
Right. Someone, Angel Garcia, asked that this book reminded him of Carolina Gonzalez and Seth Kugel wrote Nueva York, the complete guide to Latino life in the 5 boroughs. A little bit of social justice history stuff was in there as well, but not fully the way yours is. If you heard of it, you might be interested in it.
Yes, it's on my shelf. I'm looking at it right now, and it was a great resource for us also.
Yeah, we were lucky to have, I think a challenge in writing this book, but also something that made it really pleasurable and easier is that there is so much written about New York City. And, we were trying very hard not to, it is obviously a work of synthesis with a lot of original interpretations and, and research involved, but we had an abundance of fantastic sources to work from, including a number from our colleagues, like Josh Freeman's Working Class New York was an incredibly important book. The Power Broker that Emily just brought up, A Covenant with Color, book by Craig Stephen Wilder about Black Brooklyn, which is one of my all-time favorite books. Gotham.
Gotham. I was going to ask you about Gotham. It'd be hard to write about New York City without the Wallace and Burroughs first volume and then Mike's second volume.
Right. So Gotham and Gotham Unbound were
Gotham
both
Unbound, right?
Tremendously important sources for us. And the list goes on and on and on. And similarly, there are many people who do fantastic web work, So when Steve, you were asking previously about us having a website, there is a fantastic website called Place Matters that, drills down on places all over the city. It has a similar, kind of zeitgeist. It's more, I would say, culturally oriented. Ours is more like social struggle, social justice oriented, but that's a fantastic resource for people who are interested in learning more deeply about New York. So, that was an amazing thing for all of us and hard to give up. I'm still getting a lot of New York books all the time.
All you have to do is go to the Strand, which is 2 blocks from my house, and the section on New York City history is shelves and shelves and shelves of books. So you're mining a rich vein of intellectual ore there, and it's great that you can rely on the work that others have done and build on it. And I think you've done that remarkably well in this book. Let me give you, we're coming near the end of our time. Let me each of you a minute or two to sum up, final thoughts, things you want people to take away, etc. Start with you, Penny, you're on screen, and then Carolina and Emily.
So funny, one can't tell when one is on screen. I want to thank everybody who's been here this evening or anyone who's listening to this after the fact. And I don't know. I am worried about the future of New York City, to be honest. I think that I love the city mostly because I love all the human beings in it and both the amazing and terrible things we all bring to it. And I hope that the stories that we tell in this book help all of us to make this city stronger and make each other stronger, in our struggles in the future. And that's what I hope, this book can contribute.
Great. Carolina?
Yeah, I'll just add, like like all cities, it's a city of contradictions, and I hope that people will see that and will engage with that and will add to that, and make it the city we want it to be for the future.
Emily?
I would just say, I hope people engage with it in whatever way makes sense to them, right? And we talked a little bit about, like, I think it's a book you can pick up and put down, read 1 page of, read 30 pages of, go to places if you want to, or not go to places, just read about them. And so I hope, I just hope that people find joy in it wherever and however they can. And I should also just plug, because this is a question in the question and answer.
Oh.
Our next talk is at Blue Stockings on Zoom, and we'll share on social media more about that. And we'll share more on social media about any in-person events that we have, which we are all dying to have. So as soon as the bookstores let us do it, we will be doing that and shouting widely about it. And thank you so much for being so interested. Really
well, let me thank Penny and Carolina and Emily for a very stimulating conversation and a very stimulating book. Let me thank you for the School of Labor and Urban Studies. And those of you who are watching, go out and buy the book. That's the important thing. It's fun to talk about books, better to read them and use them. Michael, I'll turn it all back to you, I think, to say any final words.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And stay tuned for our next program, which is coming up on May 5th. And that will be another book talk with the authors of The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. So thanks, everybody, and see you next time.